What is going on, AP Human Geography? It is Mr. Majewski. I am back for our next foray into Unit 6, which is, of course, Urban Geography. We're going to be hitting subtopics 6.3 and 6.4 today, Cities and Globalization, and we're going to call it the size and distribution of cities. So sit back, relax, right? Strap on the seatbelts. Notes on this if they need to be taken, right? How about use the slides and maybe just add on to the slides that I've already provided to you. And then you kind of already have pre-made notes available to you as well. All right, whatever option works best for you. There will be some application activities in class this week that you'll need to do based on this information. Let's get right into it. All right. Okay, so we're starting with early urbanization. And I mean, hey, this is just a super fast, quick run through this topic. You don't need to know much of it in detail at all. Um, our earliest urban settlements, where do we see the first urban settlements? Well, the Fertile Crescent, Southwest Asia, is generally identified as the earliest site where we see large scale urban settlements. Amongst the oldest is UR, right? You've heard it pronounced both ways. It's located in what was then Mesopotamia. That would be present day Iraq. So, again, right within the Fertile Crescent of Southwest Asia. Keep in mind, you start to see urban settlements where you see agriculture develop. So it shouldn't be a surprise that it's Southwest Asia. Remember, that was the hearth for wheat and many other major agricultural products. As a result, we see cities pop up there as well. We also eventually see them in Asia, right, where we see agriculture popping up there around the same time. Now, many of the earliest cities actually started as what we would call city states. That was a city that controlled, obviously, its area within the walls and then the immediate farmland around it. Eventually, some of these city states, and they competed with each other. For instance, across ancient Greece, there were many different city states, competed with each other. Some of them rose and grew quite powerful. Others, obviously, kind of withered away and died out. A lot of our earliest cities actually emerged as city states. They became quite politically powerful and often competed with one another. All right, images on the right hand side here are of the ancient city in Mesopotamia. We see some of the ruins that exist there. And of course, we have the images that show our belief about what this city most likely looked like when it existed thousands and thousands of years ago. Okay, we're going to fast forward. And we're going to remain in ancient times, but we're going to fast forward from ancient times. We're going to move to, about the 4th or the 5th century. All right, because this is when you really saw city change happen, especially in Europe. So around the 5th century, the Roman Empire finally collapsed. And when the Roman Empire collapsed, it controlled much of Europe at that time. And so many of the cities that existed had been under Roman control. Well, when the Roman Empire fell, Europe had a decline, and especially within the cities, a lot of cities lost massive numbers of people. People kind of moved back out into rural areas, and cities really began to decline. They lost people, they lost services that were being provided. This was a period that was known as the Dark Ages in Europe. And during this time, from about 500 till about 1100, uh, all of the largest cities in the world, all of the top 10 largest cities were in Asia. They were in China, they were in India, and they were spread throughout the rest of Asia. They weren't in Europe during this period. Now, Europeans start to see a return in the 10 and 1100s. They began to slowly begin to form again, and the reason for that was people began to flock to them again because the lords of these cities provided and were able to give protection and goods and services in exchange for service to the Lord. So you agreed to serve the Lord when needed. In exchange for that, you were provided the protection of the city and its defenses. Also, new and improved roads were created in Europe, which encouraged trade and connections between cities. Now, the towns and cities that popped up then were very dense and they were very compact. We're talking like tens of thousands of people. They were usually built with defensive walls around them, and they usually existed along those historic trade routes. Today, a lot of these earliest feudal cities, these would be what we would refer to as the old cities or the historic CBD located within many modern cities. All right, so if you go to Paris, right, or you go to Italian cities like Cittadella, what you will notice is there's the old historic area, and then oftentimes there may be built up areas around it that are more modern. But you can still see where the historic remnants of the original feudal city existed. Okay. Now, towns and cities provide services to consumers, right? The amount and the availability of the services provided, well, it depends on the population and it depends on the land area of the city, right? Services that are, and by the way, that's one of the reasons why people use cities, right? Is to access the services that are provided. Towns provide services, cities usually provide more services and more advanced services. Now, services that are provided by a settlement fall into one of two categories. They're either basic services, which are services that stand alone, they don't encourage other businesses to locate in an area. A gas station, a coffee house. If a Starbucks pops up or a Chevron pops up, you're probably not going to see that be a big magnet, right, for other large businesses to move into that area. Products with basic services are usually consumed by the residents within that community, right? Starbucks is a basic service because most of the people that are going to use it are going to be local to that area, the local coffee shop. A local diner is a basic service. Local gas stations are oftentimes basic services, right? Who's using those products the most? It's folks within the community itself. All right. Non-basic services are the other category that are provided. All right. They're services that tend to attract other businesses to locate in the area as well. These are usually products that are made in these services that are a little more costly, and oftentimes they're not necessarily consumed by the people in the area where they're made. Let me give you an example here. A steel mill locates in a new area, right? And obviously, it's going to construct steel. And most of that steel is probably not going to be used in that area. It's going to be exported to other towns and cities for building purposes. All right. But here's the other thing. When a steel mill locates in an area, right, it's going to potentially employ hundreds of people. Well, that's going to cause other businesses to be attracted there as well. You're going to see gas stations and restaurants pop up, right, so that the workforce has, food that they eat at lunch and they have gas to get them to and from work and home every single day, right? So that steel mill is going to actually attract a lot more businesses to the area because, right, it might even attract, businesses that are associated with steel production, right, that want to be closer to the steel mill as well. Those are non-basic services. Cities oftentimes are really interested in non-basic services. They want to attract businesses that provide non-basic services because bringing a non-basic service or business to your area means that it's automatically going to generate or attract other businesses and create more jobs as well. Okay, it's not that basic services are bad. They're great for a city and they're great jobs as well. It's just non basic oftentimes creates jobs, right, beyond just the business um, being produced. So all settlements tend to provide the most basic services. Some small settlements may provide some non basic, right? Maybe like one or two factories in a small town. But higher level settlements usually provide more non basic services. That's one of the rules that we have. And again, non basic services almost often lead to something. It's called the multiplier effect. And so this is why city leaders are often willing to target these non basic businesses to try to bring them to the area. The governor of Texas came to California recently and tried to attract, large scale companies back to Texas that would create even more jobs in the surrounding communities there too. So, this process by which non basic services create extra jobs is known as the multiplier effect. Every non basic job in a city tends to lead to the creation of one to two other basic jobs as well. So, like I said, if you can attract industries or businesses that are non basic to your area, you'll get much more employment in other areas too. This is exactly what's happening in the Rust Belt today. I should say in the Sun Belt today of the United States, right? From Florida all the way over to California. Um, Businesses are being encouraged, right, to go there, like less cost associated with locating there. And when they do, it tends to lead to the creation of basic industry and service jobs alongside the non basic ones in those communities. Now, hey, the opposite is true too. If you lose a non basic service, if you lose a business that provides non basic jobs in your area, it's going to hurt the overall economy of your area way more than if you lost a basic job, because you're not just going to lose the jobs at the steel mill, you're probably going to have a lot of businesses go out of business that provided those basic jobs around the steel mill too. Okay, and that's what we're seeing in a lot of parts of the Rust Belt, the Great Lakes, and the Northeast of the United States. As the non basic factories leave, right, entire communities can be devastated as a result. Moving topics here. All right. And even though we just covered urban services and we again hit on this topic of the multiplier effect, what you're seeing is, right, not all services are the same and not all settlements are the same. And so we need to find ways to classify them. We need to find ways to be able to classify and distinguish them from one another. So we've created what's called a hierarchy in terms of the size of a city. This is just the straight population. All right, top to bottom. Very, very few of the types of cities at the top, a whole bunch of the cities down at the bottom. And so we have a pyramid structure for this hierarchy. The higher you go up, you go, larger size settlements, you're going to get more services provided there. The more you go down the pyramid, the more number of those settlements you'll see on Earth's surface. So, of course, we know what a megalopolis is. That's when metropolises overlap with one another, and that creates just one big giant urbanized area. Obviously, the highest level services are going to be provided in megalopolises. All right. A metropolis is any city that's usually 500,000 to a million plus. These are high and very high level services provided. Obviously, when they blend together, that creates the megalopolis, which is that giant urban area. A city is usually classified as about 100,000 people or more. Obviously, most cities tend to provide what we would describe as medium to high level services, right? More than you're going to see in the communities underneath them, but fewer than you're going to see in a metropolis, for instance. All right. Metropolis, for instance, might have a professional sports team. All right. Whereas most cities probably aren't going to be able to. Maybe they have a minor league team or something like that. All right. That would be the difference. Town. A town usually has about 10,000 or more people. And of course, towns tend to provide smaller to medium level services. Anything beyond that, you're probably going to need to go to the nearest large city to be able to access. Villages are classified as about 1,000 people in them. All right. Very small service levels of services, too small. So only the most maybe basic stuff, convenience store, maybe a grocery store, post office, gas stations, right? Maybe not much more than that. A few stoplights, who knows? And then a hamlet. A hamlet is the term we use, what, just maybe 100 people or more. This is the smallest type of settlement that exists. And you may see like a gas station there or a cafe there, right? You're not going to see much more than that in hamlets. They're going to provide the fewest and the least unique services available. All right. When we talk about services provided, right, everything that you can consume is a good or a service, right? So, like every one of these settlements is probably going to have gas stations, right? But a hamlet's probably only going to maybe have one, whereas a metropolis is going to have dozens and dozens of them. Alrighty, so that would be the difference. Also, a hamlet maybe has one gas station with certain types of fuel, right? But a metropolis is going to give you lots of different options, right? Maybe electrical charging stations as well. So you're going to have more unique services that are available too. Okay. Having said all of that, you do need to kind of know those classifications. You don't have to have the numbers necessarily memorized, but it would help. But you do need to know kind of the order, right, of urbanization from megalopolis down to a hamlet. All right. Now, we're just getting started because that was the first way that we classify cities today. We're going to actually look at 4 other ways to do it in this presentation as well. All right, now most of these you're doing an activity with, either in class this week or in our class session, all right, in week 13. So Mr. M's going to fly through this material because we're going to be spending more time on each of these on our own. Okay, first way to classify where and how cities and services are located and their size is central place theory. This is the most famous. This is the historic theory. This is a lot like von Thunen, right? In that It is kind of the historic theory that you need to know. Okay, a lot of different concepts and terms here. So, what the central place theory said is that every region in a state, right, and every city within a state has what's called a sphere of influence. All right. Um, the man who creates this theory actually called it a hinterland, right, which was its sphere of influence, how far its influence reaches outward into the surrounding communities. When we say influence, we mean like how willing are people to go to that and use that city for its goods and services? Okay, large cities tend to have larger spheres of influence. People are willing to travel longer to get to them to use those services. Small communities, probably a very small one. You're not willing to travel very far, right, to use those services. Central place is the name for a settlement, right? Another name for a settlement. And it depends on the type of goods and services that are provided to by it, right, in terms of its size and importance. All right. So every central place is a settlement, and every central place has a sphere of influence, also known as a hinterland, which is how much of a magnet are they to the surrounding area, the surrounding region. Now, every central place also has two other things, right? It has what is called a threshold and a range. All right. A threshold is the minimum number of people that is needed to support a central place or to support a business in that central place. All right. Um, a gas station's going to need a relatively small threshold, right? It's not necessarily going to need millions and millions of people in order to survive. It's probably only going to need hundreds of people in the surrounding area or thousands of people in order to have a minimum enough threshold to stay in business. But a professional sports team, they're going to need to have a massive minimum threshold, right? Because running a professional sports team is expensive and paying those salaries. And so you better have a lot of people that are willing to support and pay for your team. And so the threshold for a sports team is much, much larger, right? Probably like a city of like 500,000 or a million. Whereas a gas station, probably a city of a few hundred could support a gas station. Okay? The range is also part of a central place, and the range is how far people are willing to travel at a maximum to travel for a good or a service, either in that city, in that central place. All right, so most of us probably aren't going to be willing to drive more than a couple of miles from one gas station to another. Um, but when it comes to, oh, I don't know, luxury car companies or dealers, we're probably willing to drive further away in order to get that dream luxury car, right? Because we might be able to save so much more money on it from one dealer to another. So the range also determines a central place and its sphere of influence. Okay, so again, central place is a city. Sphere of influence is how far its influence reaches outward from the city itself. How do we determine that? By determining the threshold and range of that central place. Now, one last thing. Not only can you determine a central place for a threshold and range for every central place, you can actually do it for every business in that community as well. Alrighty, so this is a powerful tool that can be used. Every central place is going to provide goods and services, right? Um, and you can divide those goods and services into two categories. You can divide them into lower order goods, which we would consider to be necessities. Those are usually cheaper products that are purchased frequently. And then higher order goods, which often we would label as more luxuries, maybe not necessities. Not essential most of the time and are purchased infrequently. Lower order goods tend to be available in all central places, right? Higher order goods tend to be more available in larger central places. All right. So places or industries that have large thresholds and ranges tend to locate in larger cities because they need to satisfy those requirements. Whereas services with lower thresholds and ranges can choose to locate in any central place regardless of size and still realistically be successful. All right, so the central place theory is developed by a geographer named Walter Christaller. And it's a spatial theory, right? It attempts to explain why things are distributed across space, across an area, across the globe. And it tries to explain the reasons why the distribution patterns the size and the number of cities exist the way they do around the world. Now, like every theorist, Kristaller uses a number of assumptions in his model. We know these assumptions are not true, so they're automatically flaws with the model itself, right? Um, but he's acknowledging that ahead of time, right? And saying, I'm just going to assume all of these are true so that we can test how accurate this theory is in different places to see how realistic it is. So he assumed, populations are evenly distributed across a place, and so are the resources. We know that's not true in real life, but he assumed that was. All right. He assumed all the settlements that he would be using in his model were equally distant from one another. All right. And he said they tend to exist in triangular patterns from one another. Now, we know the layout of cities doesn't reflect that specifically, but we can still use that model and apply different places to it. He assumed there were no barriers and no changes in climate that might affect where people accessed services. Um, and he assumed that the goods are sold and that the transport cost to places is the same. So there would be no difference in going from one settlement to another because the prices would be the same. And transportation costs between two equally distant places are the same, even if in reality they wouldn't be. So those are all the assumptions, right? Now let's get to what he said. Quick reminder, there's the hierarchy for cities: megalopolises, metropolises, cities, towns, villages, hamlets. Okay, so what central place theory says is the larger the settlement size, the fewer there are of those on Earth. So the larger population, the fewer you're going to see of those places on Earth. The larger the settlement, the greater the distance between them. So large settlements tend to spread out and not be clustered together. And as a settlement increases in size, the range and number of functions and higher order goods increases as well. And so what Chris Dollar argued was we could actually take each city, each town, each village, each hamlet, and we could create what's called a hinterland for that. Now, we could draw circles around it, he said, but he chose to use the hexagon shape. And that shows like the maximum impact of that city has on people. People in that area choose to access that city for goods and services most of the time. And what he noticed was the hexagons for large cities tended to be, well, quite large and tended to draw people in from much further away. Hexagons in towns and villages, they tended to be much smaller in size. And so the goods and services that were provided in those places tend to draw people in from much closer areas only. All right. Based on his findings, he decided to label the map with these hexagon shapes to kind of show in detail how people access services. So what he came up with is he didn't want to use circles. He said if I use circles, there's going to be gaps in between them. And how does that explain where the people in those places would go to services? It doesn't, right? And so I think I should use hexagons instead because they eliminate those gaps. And every single person, no matter where they live in a place, is accounted for in my model. So what do we have here? The circles within the hexagons represent different settlements. Alrighty. The larger the settlement, the larger the circle. And you'll notice all settlements provide low order goods, right? All settlements provide gas stations for the most part. Okay, so each of them has a small hexagon that is around them, right? You see the hexagon around the blue circle. You see the hexagon around the red circle. You see the hexagon around the blue circle here, right? Each of those represents the hinterland for that community, right? Especially for those basic goods, I should say those lower order goods. All right. But do you notice there's actually larger hexagons as well around the larger cities, right? The large towns and cities have their own larger hexagons at the same time. That's because they provide unique goods and services that the smaller communities do not. And so not only do they have a hinterland for their lower order goods, right, but they have a much larger hinterland for their medium and higher level goods that people are willing to travel much further for. And so their hinterland ends up being much larger, right, as a result of their increased size and increased services. Now, If we actually magnified this image even further, Chris Dollar would say this city here, because it's even larger than the other towns, is eventually even going to have a larger hexagon around it that only it will have, it and other red cities on the map, um, demonstrating the super unique services that only it has and that the towns do not, that people would willing to even become further for, right, to access, right, like those luxury car dealerships, like those professional sports franchises. Alrighty, so it's a, if you see hexagons, you know it is a Chris Dollar central place theory trying to explain why communities locate where they do, and the answer is because of the goods and services that are provided, which are more and higher order in larger populated cities. All right, and by the way, you're going to be doing an activity where you try this on your own, but I mean, think about this, right? Distance from home. Your part of town, right? That's 1 to 2 miles, right? So, I mean, would you be willing to travel 8 miles to Santa Ana when you can get something within your 1 to 2 mile range of your community? Probably not, right? Um, if you can get them both at the same place, around the same price, chances are you're probably going to go to the one that's closer. It would be inefficient. It would be wasteful to go to Santa Ana, and it would be super inefficient and wasteful to go to LA, right? Or any of those other places. And so, for certain goods and services, you're probably not willing to travel more than 1 to 2 miles. And that's Chris Dollar's entire point. Alrighty. Now, Anaheim's a giant settlement, right? But if we broke it up maybe into smaller neighborhoods or communities, and you just use your community as an example, right? Your neighborhood, that's essentially like a small settlement in Chris Dollar's theory. All right. Now, you want to go to a Laker game, right? You want to go to a Clipper game? You want to go to a Dodger game? Well, you're going to need to go to Los Angeles for that, right? I mean, I guess you could go to the Angels game as well, right? Maybe we should use even a more specific example. But I think you're seeing the point here. You're probably not going to be willing to travel more than 1 to 2 miles away from your current business or service for gas. Alrighty. But you would be willing to travel further if it was the difference between a $50,000 car and a $35,000 car difference, right? A price difference between the two. So higher order goods, you tend to be willing to go further distances. Lower order goods, you tend to not be willing to go longer distances. As a result, smaller communities tend to provide low order goods and services. Larger communities tend to provide more and more unique versions. I think that covers everything we need to know for Central Place since we're applying it in class this week. Let's move to a couple of other methods we use to classify cities. Now, these are the opposites of one another. All right, so these are easy to remember because they're really kind of polar opposites of one another. So these do not necessarily measure a city or classify a city based on the services. These actually are back to based on sheer population number. We're going to start with rank size rule. All right. The presence and growth of cities varies across locations due to the physical geography and the resources, right? And one effort to try to understand those is called rank size rule or rank size distribution. What you do is you take the settlements in a country based by population and you rank them in order from largest to smallest. All right. Doing so oftentimes produces a pattern, all right, or a hierarchy. Now, it's not usually exact, but it's fairly similar to this pattern. And the rule is this: the country's nth largest settlement is 1 over n, the population of the largest settlement. So the second largest settlement is half the size of the largest. The third largest settlement in the country is 1/3 the size of the largest. The 10th largest settlement in a country is usually 1/10 the size of the largest city or settlement. The city that is the 100th largest settlement is usually 1/100th the size of the largest city in that country. And that's the pattern. All right. So you would expect, if this is true, to find countries in the world where we have that particular setup. So again, the second largest city, half the size of the largest. The third largest city is 1/3 the size of the largest. The fourth is 1/4 the size of the largest. So the second's going to be 50% of the first. The third's going to be 33% of the first. The fourth largest is going to be 25% of the first. All right. And the US actually follows this rule fairly well. If you look at just the city populations themselves, New York is about 8.5 mil, Los Angeles 4.1 mil, and Chicago 2.7 million. So again, 1, 2, 3 tend to follow the pattern fairly well. Again, in order to get to those numbers, we have to just use the city limits. All right. Um, the actual urbanized area for all of those cities is much larger. That's it. That's the rank size rule. All right. Now, the opposite of that is something called the primate city. All right. I think a primate, I think of, oh, but a primate city is a city where the largest, is a country where the largest city is more than twice the population of the second largest. And usually it's much more than that. But it's not just size, it's also that its significance, that its importance is much, much larger as well, politically, socially, economically. Alrighty. Primate cities tend to truly dominate the country. They're usually the heart of the country. To be honest with you, they usually not only are the cluster of population, they're also usually the cluster of economic and political power too. What that leads to is oftentimes the areas further from that primate city tend to have a lot of uneven development. Alrighty. You'll actually see in many places where a primate city is almost like the heartbeat of the country in terms of all the roads, all the infrastructure, all the power grids, all connect there as well. All right, great example of primate cities. London, England, 7.2 million. The next closest is Birmingham, right? 2.3. So as you can see, way more than double. Paris, how about this? 9.6 million in Paris. The next closest is Marseille, about a million, a little less than a million people. All right. So we could see what, not only like when you think of France, if I said name a French city, everybody's probably going to jump out Paris right away. Probably going to jump out London right away. All righty. If we go to places that have more of a rank size rule, you're going to notice that's not the case. You're going to think of maybe multiples at the same time, or maybe not even be aware of a city that jumps out at you at first. Why do we bring up primate and rank size? Because they're ways for us to try to compare cities, the city growth within a country. And we can say, hey, I think this country is following the rank size rule more, or I think this country is following the primate rule a little bit more. And then we can look at the data a little bit more beyond population and see whether, in fact, that is true or not. Just so you know, most of the time, um, countries do not follow either of these rules perfectly. So it's more of a which of these two is this country resembling more? All right, is oftentimes the sort of question. Last of these models I want us to cover this week is called the gravity model. We're going to work on this in class. And by the way, rank size and primate, you're going to do an activity on in class this week too. Rank size, gravity, we're going to actually cover in class. Um, and the gravity model is really, really easy. All right. I just want you to think about like in space or anything like that. The larger an object is in space, the more pull it has towards it, right? The more things are attracted to it. So, the sun has a much larger, right, gravity pull than Earth does because it's a much larger body. Okay? Anyways, we applied the same concept to cities to understand the gravity model. It predicts the optimal location of a service being directly related to the number of people in the area and inversely related, so opposite to the distance people have to travel to access it. So the best locations are the one that minimize travel for all customers. It's really, really easy with the gravity model. All right, so I'm not going to spend much more than a minute on it here. Large cities tend to have closer connections to other large cities. There's a larger arrow between the two of them, of people, of goods, of ideas. Alrighty? Small cities tend to not have as much of a connection to each other because they're smaller. And large cities tend to be more connected to one another than they are to any individual small city. All right, let me give you an example here. Los Angeles is much more connected by the gravity model in terms of movement of people, in terms of the movement of economic activity, innovation, right? To San Francisco than we are to Fresno, California, right? Why? Because San Francisco is much larger, right, than Fresno is. Okay? The other part of the gravity model is places that are closer together tend to have closer connections, and places that are longer, further apart, tend to have less connection. So, large places that are close to each other tend to be very connected. All right? Smaller sized places that are further apart tend to have less connection. All right? And if we're talking about two large cities, right, and we're deciding between which one to go to, and they're equally sized, then we're going to choose the one that is closer to us according to the gravity model. These are the rules of the gravity model. Large tends to attract large. All right, have greater connections than too small. And when I say large and small, I'm talking about population. All right, closer cities, settlements tend to have closer connections to than further away. And like I said, when you're determining where to go to, you're going to determine based on opportunity and size of city, and also based on distance, all right, to determine the ideal location to go. That's it. That's the gravity model. We're going to practice it in class, so it's going to be easy once we do that. Globalization, we've already covered this. I don't have much to say on it. We know what it is. We've been covering it since Unit 1. It's increased communication, connection, reliance between different people, between different countries, between businesses around the world. Technology, transportation are two great examples, right? Modern business and trade are great examples as well. It is the primary method by which culture is spread, especially popular culture. Um, you know what this means. They conduct different areas of their business in different countries. When I say they, I mean corporations, right? Example, raw product harvested in Central Africa, but it's used to manufacture goods made in China, and then it's shipped around the world for sale. All right, now, who advances globalization the most beyond governments? Well, companies do, businesses do, corporations do, through advertising, through commercials, through products, through other medium. Um, and they have advantages and incentives provided to them by local governments, oftentimes to locate in new places. Okay, so remember when we're talking about cities forming, right, and the spread of urban ideas, oftentimes businesses, corporations locate in a new area, and that sparks growth in that city. Last thing, I want you to become familiar with a whole nother topic. All right. This doesn't really have anything to do with population. This is all about importance. All right. Because there's another term we need to familiarize ourselves with. They're called world cities, sometimes called global cities. It's a city that's considered a major center for finance, for trade, for business, for politics, for culture, or even science information. Um, Information gathering, mass media, any and all of these things may be occurring here. It's known worldwide as providing that. It's a place where large number of services in one area or many areas have clustered together. They've chosen to cluster together. It's a global hotbed, a place that provides global services that are used by everyone else around the world. World cities are considered especially important, especially critical for economic growth globally, for political agreements, for global cultural development. Cities compete to be designated as world cities. All right, and you can get or lose this status depending on how important you are to the global economy. Now, there's no population requirement, but I'll just tell you right now, pretty much every world city is or close to a megacity, which means, of course, more than 10 million people. So, a high percentage of the world's businesses is transacted, and political power is often concentrated in these cities. These world or global cities usually are, like I said, are home to headquarters of large businesses and corporations, oftentimes many if they are a high level world city. They often can be the headquarters for media, right? Companies like NBC, ABC, maybe radio companies as well, advertising companies. And they are access to major political and academic decision makers and power. All right. Some cities have all of these clustered there. All right, others really focus maybe on one of those categories. So before we begin with what are and what are not world cities, you need to know that there are currently what are considered to be three majors. We call these alpha plus pluses, A plus pluses: New York, London, Tokyo. They have all of those three categories in large numbers: headquarters of businesses, media control, access to political and academic decision making. Then what we do is we then rank other cities with letters. After alpha plus plus is A alpha plus, and then alpha, and then A minus, and then, beta plus, then beta minus, which is B, and then gamma, which is C, plus and minus. All right. And what we end up with is a list that looks like this. Now, I've only just picked a handful. I've already told you who the A++ pluses are. You'll notice the cities in blue are located in the United States. So we have one of the three major global or world cities. Then look at the group that's underneath: Shanghai, Paris, Singapore, Dubai, Hong Kong. There's a couple of others as well that I didn't list, but no American cities. And in fact, you'll notice almost all of those cities are Asian. And that's where we've seen a ton of growth, where these cities have now been elevated to A plus status just underneath the major world cities. That's a sign, right, of the changing political and economic power shifting to Asia in modern times. For frame of reference, I've told you what some other American cities fall into, which categories. So, for instance, Los Angeles and Chicago and San Fran are all considered A cities. All right. They're in the third tier of world cities. Atlanta, Dallas, those are B cities. And then, smaller places like Orlando, or maybe less globally connected places like Phoenix, Sacramento, California. Those are called C world level world cities. Anaheim, we don't fall into any of these categories. The closest we would be is C at this point. Just to be on this list is an incredible achievement, right? Because it basically means you're important in terms of the world's settlements. It does go up and down over time, so cities can be raised or dropped. Um, the greatest growth, like I mentioned, is in Asia, especially China. Hong Kong, we've seen Shanghai as well. Beijing is on there as well. We've seen a gradual shift towards Asia, like I've mentioned, in terms of world city importance, but that's a gradual shift we've seen in economic activity to Asia as well. The majority of world cities are still clustered in Europe and North America. Even though we have more growth in Asia, overwhelmingly, most still located in the developed world, especially Europe and the US. Like I said, a city reaches world status when other settlements have so many connections to that world city, they're dependent on that world city. These world cities are considered to be the epicenters, like I mentioned, of global decision making. And why are these multinational corporations so important? Well, they're located around the globe. And so their decisions often have massive multiplier effects on the rest of the region or the globe. You'll see copycats being done by other businesses and activities in those regions. Coke started in Atlanta. It's now a global corporation located in something like 190 countries around the world. McDonald's, same thing. Franchised in Chicago, it's now a global corporation. And so their influence in terms of their advertising and the decisions they make immediately happen in almost every country instantaneously. Nike, another great example, started in Oregon, right, and has become a global dominant power. These corporations have major influences over politicians, right, and they have major influences over one another. And so that's why corporations are so important to urbanization, globalization, and popular culture. I think that might be it for us. It is. All right. By the way, positive negatives of corporations. I mean, corporations provide goods usually mass production at cheaper rates. So they tend to give us more products at cheaper prices than we would pay, right? But the cost of that is, of course, standardization of products, right? Tough for small businesses to compete with corporations, right? We also sometimes lose some of that folk, local, indigenous culture because multinational corporations benefit from the spread of popular consumer ideas. Alrighty. Anyways, good stuff. Hope this helped. Notes, fill in the slides here. If you don't need either of those and you can just use the slides in order to understand, that's fine as well. Mr. M signing off. Have a great day and an even better week, folks.